Okay, we're going to wrap up chapter 14 talking about both positive and negative social behaviors. So, social psychologists look at behaviors on both ends of the spectrum, both positive and negative, to understand human nature as a whole. So, let's start with some of the more positive social behaviors. The first is liking. So, this is the study of interpersonal attraction and close relationships. This area addresses the factors that lead to having positive feelings towards others. And there are a few important factors that research has shown to initially attract two people to each other. Um, the first is proximity. So, chances are you become friendliest with those who live closest to you geographically. Now, this was even more true before the time of the internet. I had a few pen pals growing up. Um, this is going to date me a bit. And I remember when, quote unquote, the online, the internet became a thing. Um, but I was most close to those people that lived close to me or that at had some point lived near me. So I had a girlfriend when I was younger. We were best friends, and she moved to Germany when we were, I think, 8 or 9. So we were pen pals, right? But at one point, we did live in geographical approximation to each other. Um, and so research has sort of shown that, you're probably going to be most friendly with those that live near you. The second factor is exposure. Repeated exposure to a person can also result in attraction if the encounters are positive. So, if your initial encounter is strongly negative, then repeated exposure probably will result in you actually disliking them even more. There is the rare occasion where you have sort of an off day, right? You have a wrong first impression. You get off on the wrong foot, right? And you sort of write that with the other person. But typically, if it's a really negative first interaction, the interactions after that are not going to result in you wanting to spend more time with that person. The third factor is similarities. So we tend to like those who are similar to us. If they share similar attitudes, belief, or values, it usually leads us to liking the other person more. So you hear sort of the old adage that says opposites attract, right? And then you also have one, birds of a feather flock together. I think they talk about these in your book. Research has pretty definitively shown that while you can have some differences, you might be opposite on some things. In the more major attitudes or beliefs or values, you're probably going to be the same um, with those that you have relationships with. I have, a couple girlfriends. I have one girlfriend who I would say is much more outgoing than I am. I like to be in smaller groups with one or two people. I don't really like going out and being around a lot of people. And she's sort of the opposite of that. So people might look at us and say, oh, well, you guys are very different. But really, when you look at all of our values, our beliefs, our thoughts on life, our thoughts on religion, our thoughts on, right and wrong, that type of stuff, it's the same, right? So those sort of bigger things, our values, our beliefs, our attitudes towards the world are the same, right? So it's more that you're similar to each other, and that's who you end up sort of being attracted to. There's also something called the reciprocity of liking effect. So, this states that we're more likely to like someone that also likes us, right? So, knowing that someone else views you positively actually increases your attraction to that person. Now, for these first three factors, we're not talking about your physical attraction, although that can also happen. It just means you're attracted or drawn to the other person, like to spend more time with them, right? Um, and you're more likely to attract towards people who are like you and who also like you, right? The fourth factor is physical attractiveness. So now we're talking about the physical attraction. And in fact, many studies have suggested that this initial physical attractiveness is the most important factor when you're looking at this one particular study was looking at college students and dating. So that first initial sort of meet, physical attractiveness is very important, but as the couples get to know each other, it becomes less and less important. So, as those sort of bigger life values, beliefs, attitudes come into play, you often see this with couples, right? Maybe they're extremely physically attracted to each other when they first start dating, but then they get to know each other and they realize they have nothing in common. They don't view the world the same, they don't agree on anything. And that physical attraction isn't as important anymore, right? Because those bigger values and beliefs don't match up. And there's a ton of research on liking and how it develops and the factors that go into it. But love is a bit trickier, right? There's not as much research that tells us definitively what this is and how it develops and how it works. And social psychologists view loving as something completely different than liking. So it's not that loving is just a greater quantity of liking, right? It's not like it's the next logical step. They actually view it as something else entirely because it encompasses very different behaviors. We see relatively intense physiological arousal, often an all encompassing interest in the other individual. You have fantasizing about the individual, rapid swings of emotion, usually revolving around that individual. We have elements of passion, sexual desire, fascination, exclusiveness, all of which are things that you don't see with liking, right? If you think about, for example, the friends that you were attracted to, not physically attracted to, but I just mean drawn to, right, when you first met them, exclusivity doesn't come with that, right? That's different. You don't meet one friend and then say, okay, now I'm only going to be friends with you until we're not friends anymore. And then I'll be friends with someone else. But when we're talking about loving, that is something that can be encompassed in it. Not in every relationship, right? There are open relationships and polyamorous relationships and things like that. But exclusivity is something that in some relationships, loving relationships, is an element, whereas in your liking relationships, it probably isn't, right? And researchers have theorized that there are two types of loving there's the passionate romantic love and the compassionate love. Passionate or romantic love is being intensely absorbed with someone that includes, as I mentioned, intense psychological arousal, psychological interest, and caring for the needs of the other person. Whereas compassionate love is a strong affection that we have for those with whom our lives are deeply involved. So, this is the kind of love you have, for example, your family, maybe your parents or siblings or grandparents. And maybe for some people, even their closest friends, they almost consider those friends as family, right? They would also be included in compassionate love. Then Robert Sternberg was a social psychologist who kind of took it one step further and stated, okay, well, loving is actually made up of three components, and then those three components make up different types of love. So the first component he proposed was decision and commitment. So these are sort of the initial thoughts that you love someone, right? That's the decision portion of it. And then the longer term feelings of commitment to maintain that love. So that's the commitment portion of it. The second component is the intimacy component. And this is of feelings of closeness and connectedness to the other person. And finally, we have the passion component, which refers to the motivational drive related to sex, physical closeness, and romance. So that's passion. And like I said, according to Sternberg, These three components are going to combine in various ways and produce the different kinds of love. So let's look at those different kinds of love he proposed. So at the top, you see liking, which is the component of intimacy. Romantic love, there on the left, is made up of the components of intimacy and passion combined. On the right, we have companionate love, which is made up of intimacy and decision commitment components. On the bottom left, you see infatuation, which only includes the passion component. And of course, bottom right, we have empty love, which only includes decision or commitment component. In the middle bottom, we have fatuous love, which includes passion and decision commitment components. And finally, in the middle, you have consummate love, which is produced by all three components combined. And Sternberg suggests that all these different combinations of components are going to vary over the course of the relationship. So, depending on sort of where you are in the relationship, you might be experiencing different combinations of these components. So, for example, he proposed that passion or infatuation, right, peaks really early in a relationship, but declines and sort of levels off. Whereas decision and commitment peaks and remains stable when you're in a loving and committed relationship. So that will sort of peak, as you're going into the relationship and then remain stable. But how important is love really? I think is the question sometimes people ask when we're looking at these things and seeing how they work. Where we are, right, in the US, it's considered a pretty important factor, especially for a relation, like a physical relationship or marriage, right? A long term physical relationship and marriage. Um, People usually say like that they love their significant other, and if they don't love them anymore, it often ends in divorce, right? So, love is something that we talk about a lot in the US. But in other cultures and countries, that's not the case, right? It's not, sometimes it's not even on the list. And if it is, it's definitely not as high of a priority as we place on love. So think about arranged marriages. You can think about how often the couple getting married doesn't even know each other, right? And they do often fall in love over time. That love sort of grows as the relationship continues on. And in other cultures, it's just not an important thing. They look at things like physical health, right? Your how pleasant you are, your pleasant demeanor. Is it nice to be around you? Those things are looked at as more important than what we would define as love. So just something to keep in mind. Okay. So now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about the more negative side of social behaviors, and we'll start with aggression. And the question with these behaviors is often, are these just a part of human nature? Or are these behaviors a result of our circumstances and environment? And if we change those circumstances, can we then change the amount of aggressive behavior we see people exhibit? From my point of view and my education as a behavior analyst, we very much view these behaviors as a result of the circumstances and environment. In a moment, I'm going to present a theory that these behaviors are innate, which means we're born with them. But I don't adhere to that theory. I do believe that these behaviors are learned and that they can be changed, that they can be decreased if we change the environment and the stimuli that are producing those aggressive behaviors. I do think that they are a result of our circumstances, not just part of who we are or that we're born with them. But aggression can sometimes be a difficult term to define. If you think about all of the different situations in which someone can harm or be aggressive towards another person, Sometimes we're talking about physical aggression, right? Someone getting into a bar fight and punching someone. But sometimes we're, talking about maybe how someone talks to you, right? Like you can say, oh, they were so aggressive. Like the way they were talking was so aggressive. Or you can say, oh, that driver's being so aggressive. Um, so I think so the example I gave of getting in a bar fight, right, and punching someone, I think that's pretty obvious. I think a lot of people would say that's aggressive behavior. But what about a band trashing their hotel room while they're celebrating the release of their newest album? Would we define that as aggression? Some would say yes. Like there might be some of you saying, well, yeah, like that's kind of aggressive behavior. So you can see, and some people might be saying no, um, you know, they aren't like hurting anyone. Like they shouldn't have done that. Maybe it was wrong and they'll have to pay for it, but that's not aggressive behavior. So you can see how, based on your own definition of what aggressive behavior is, we can look at different instances and view them differently. So, to kind of level the playing field a little bit, social psychologists define aggression based on the intent and purpose behind the behavior. So, any behavior that is done to intentionally cause harm or injury to someone else is going to be considered aggressive behavior. So, that's what we're talking about in this context, in this class, when we're looking at aggressive behaviors. If there's an intent, if there's a purpose, of physically harming someone else or injuring someone else, we're talking about aggressive behavior. And as I mentioned, there are different theories surrounding aggression and aggressive behavior. So Sigmund Freud suggested that aggression is the outcome of innate or inborn urges. He stated that aggression is a primary instinctual drive, and we're born with it, right? So we're born with these aggressive tendencies or aggressive behaviors that we engage in. Additionally, Conrad Lorenz, who also thought that this was an inborn behavior, he also suggested that aggressive energy sort of builds up inside of us over time until we're able to discharge it through the process of catharsis. So he even suggested that society should provide ways for people to release this aggressive behavior when it builds up, that we should have purposefully aggressive sports and things like that where people can get their aggression out. Um, Current research has greatly contradicted this explanation of aggression, this catharsis, and like this need to release aggression. And if we don't release it, we become, it builds up more and more, and we're going to be even more aggressive when we finally release it. Their research has pretty much shown that that is not the case. So social psychologists kind of start to look for other explanations of this behavior. And another explanation that is often considered is that of observational learning. So this is the one typically behavior analysts adhere to. A lot of social psychologists look at this, learning psychologists. Um, and we touched on this a little bit throughout the semester, but observational learning emphasizes social and environmental conditions, right? So, what the individual is experiencing in their environment and the other social individuals that are around them and the behaviors that they're engaging in. This theory states that we learn aggression by watching others' behavior and observing either the reward or maybe the punishment they receive for such behavior. If consequences for aggressive behavior are positive, so if we see someone essentially getting rewarded for that aggressive behavior, then the person observing is more likely to also engage in aggressive behavior. We see this with kids all the time, right? If they see someone engage in aggressive behavior, if people laugh, if they get rewarded for that, if they win the game, we see kids also engage in that aggressive behavior as well. A classic example of this, of observational learning with aggression, is that of the Bobo doll experiment. Some of you may have heard of this. It's a pretty well known study. And I always find it to be it's a really interesting study. But what they did was they had children, they split them up in different groups, and they had one group of children watch a video of an adult engaging in aggressive behaviors towards this blow up boba doll. So it's like this big stand up, like blow up thing. And if you hit it, it sort of falls over, but then it pops right back up. Right. Um, so one group of kids going to observe a video of adults um, acting aggressively towards this boba doll. They're punching him, they're yelling at him, they're kicking him, they're trying to knock him over. Um, and this group, the first group, observed the adults receiving positive consequences for this aggressive behavior. So they were given things like praise. They were told, "Yeah, good job, get it, get that boba doll." They were given toys. They were given special snacks and treats. And the child is observing this on the video, right? So this isn't even a child observing this in real life. Which this study sort of took it a step further and said, if children observe this on a screen, right? So it's not even happening right in front of them. The other group watched this video of these adults, acting aggressive towards the boba doll, and they saw these adults getting negative consequences for this behavior. So they were scolded. The study even says the adults were spanked, which I think is pretty comical. I don't know how that looked, an adult spanking another adult, but they were scolded. Whatever was done to them on the video was definitely not a positive consequence. Like, it was pretty clear to the kids that these adults were getting in trouble for being mean to the boba doll. Okay, so these kids watched these two different videos, right? Then what they did was they put the children in the room with the boba doll and they said, okay, you can play with the boba doll. There's no consequences for their behavior. They don't get any positive consequences. They don't get any negative consequences. Okay, no matter what they do. And those children who observe the adults contact those positive consequences for beating up the boba doll, they were much more likely to engage in aggressive behaviors towards that blow up doll. Whereas the children who saw the adults get negative consequences, they didn't really interact with the boba doll at all. They definitely didn't engage in aggressive behaviors. So again, we have children not only watching a behavior and imitating it, but doing so based on the consequence that follows the behavior. And we see this happen a lot when we look at aggressive behaviors, lending towards the idea that these are learned, right? We see an increase in aggressive behaviors when they're observed in the environment by other people, and especially even more so when kids see those aggressive behaviors result in some sort of positive consequence. And that's it for chapter 14.